I stood at the altar waiting to marry the woman I loved, while three empty chairs in the front row silently told me exactly what her family thought I was worth. They didn't miss our wedding by accident. They chose not to come because, in their eyes, I was just a dirt-poor nobody who would never be good enough for their daughter. What they didn't know was that years later, I would quietly sell my company for $186 million. And after one photo appeared online of my wife and me stepping off my private jet, my father-in-law suddenly called. "We need to talk. Family meeting tomorrow." He thought he was calling me back because he could use me. He had no idea I was walking in with the one thing his family feared most: the truth. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I read every comment, and I genuinely love to hear your story. Now let me take you back to the day three empty chairs at my wedding changed everything. I stood at the front of the aisle with my hands folded, trying to slow my breathing. The ballroom looked exactly the way Marin had imagined it months earlier. White roses lined the aisle. Soft piano music drifted through the room. The afternoon light poured through the tall windows, giving everything a warm glow that almost made the day feel untouched. Almost. Three reserved chairs in the front row remained empty. Each carried a neatly printed place card: Orson Whitlock, Lenora Whitlock, Mercer Whitlock, my wife's father, her mother, her older brother. Every guest noticed them. No one mentioned them. I already knew they weren't coming. We had delayed the ceremony for 15 minutes. The wedding coordinator quietly checked her watch every few minutes before looking toward the entrance again. Each time the doors stayed closed. I kept telling myself traffic could explain 15 minutes. It couldn't explain a lifetime. Around me, conversations became softer. People smiled when our eyes met, but most of them quickly looked away. Sympathy has a strange weight. It never says anything out loud, yet somehow fills an entire room. I watched Marin standing just beyond the doors with her bridesmaids. She looked beautiful. She also kept glancing toward the entrance. Even then, she still hoped. Hope can survive longer than pride. The coordinator stepped beside me and lowered her voice. "Mr. Voss, would you like me to remove those reserve cards before everyone notices?" I looked at the chairs for another moment. "No," she hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Leave them exactly where they are." She nodded without another question. Those chairs weren't embarrassing me. They were telling the truth. A few minutes later, the music changed. The doors opened. Marin appeared holding her bouquet with both hands. Her smile reached everyone except her own eyes. As she slowly walked toward me, I could tell she was still searching the room one last time. Not for applause, for her family. She found only empty seats. When she reached me, she slipped her hand into mine. It was colder than usual. "I'm sorry," she whispered before anyone else could hear. I gently squeezed her fingers. "You have nothing to apologize for." Her eyes filled for just a second before she blinked the tears away. That moment settled something inside me. This wasn't about what they thought of me. It never really had been. This was about what they were willing to do to their own daughter, simply because she chose someone they believed wasn't good enough. For years, they had looked at me as though poverty explained my character. I drove old trucks, worked impossible hours, built my company quietly without telling anyone outside a very small circle. To them, none of that mattered. All they ever saw was a man who hadn't been born into their world. I could have defended myself 100 different times. Instead, I usually chose peace. Looking back, I realized I'd spent much of my adult life believing peace required somebody to surrender their place at the table. More often than not, that person was me. The officiant welcomed everyone, and the ceremony finally began. As Marin spoke her vows, I stopped noticing the whispers. I stopped thinking about the empty entrance. I focused only on the woman standing in front of me. When it was my turn, I made promises that sounded ordinary to everyone else. Only one remained unspoken. No matter who walks away from us today, I'll never be the one who does. When the officiant introduced us as husband and wife, applause filled the ballroom. People stood, they smiled. Some even wiped away tears. Yet those three empty chairs never moved. They stayed exactly where they had been from the beginning, silent, patient, impossible to ignore. After the ceremony, photographers gathered everyone for family pictures. Friends stepped forward, co-workers laughed together. Extended relatives arranged themselves into groups. One elderly guest quietly asked, "Where are Marin's parents? I thought they'd be sitting up front." Nobody answered. The photographer simply adjusted his camera. A bright flash lit the room. The three empty chairs remained just outside the frame. Oddly enough, that silence hurt more than any insult anyone could have spoken aloud. Before we headed toward the reception, I found myself wondering something I never expected to ask on my wedding day. Have you ever looked around during one of the biggest moments of your life and realized the people you needed most simply chose not to come? If you've lived through something like that, I'd truly like to hear your story. As I followed my wife toward the ballroom, I honestly believed those three empty chairs would become the hardest memory I'd ever carry. I had no idea the dinner before our wedding had already decided everything. I used to think the empty chairs at our wedding were the beginning of their rejection. They weren't. By the time Marin walked down that aisle, her family had already made their decision. It started several weeks earlier, at dinner in her parents' house in Highland Park. I remember pulling into the long driveway in my old pickup, the same one Orson would later glance at, like it explained everything he needed to know about me. The Vale House was the kind of place that didn't need to announce money. It simply existed in it. Limestone columns, tall windows, a front door polished so perfectly it looked like nobody had ever touched it with a working hand. Marin squeezed my arm before we stepped inside. "Just be yourself," she said. I smiled because that was easy advice for someone whose family already approved of who she was. Inside, old portraits lined the hallway. Men in suits, women in pearls. Children posed beside horses, sailboats, college banners. Every frame seemed to say the same thing. People like us belong here. People like you are visiting. Dinner was served at a table long enough to make conversation feel like a business meeting. Orson sat at the head. Lenora watched everything with that careful smile people use when they want to seem kind without offering warmth. Mercer showed up late, kissed his mother on the cheek, and looked at me like I was already taking up too much space. No one insulted me directly. That would have been too honest. Orson asked about my company halfway through the meal. "So, Callan," he said, cutting into his steak, "you're still working on that little software project?" Marin stiffened beside me. "It's a logistics platform," I said, "mostly for hospital supply systems." "Right, right." He nodded like he was humoring a child. "Startups are tricky. A lot of young men think an idea is the same thing as a business." Mercer gave a polite laugh. Lenora took a sip of wine and said, "Well, ambition is nice when you're young." I wasn't offended because Orson underestimated my work. I was offended because he had never cared enough to understand it. A few minutes later, Orson lifted his glass. "Love is important," he said, looking at Marin first, then at me. "But eventually, someone has to pay the mortgage." The table went quiet. Nobody laughed. Nobody defended me either. That was the part I remembered most. A cruel sentence can hurt, but a room full of people pretending it was reasonable can leave a mark that lasts longer. Marin looked down at her plate. I could have argued. I could have told him I had clients, contracts, payroll, and a real company growing faster than he imagined. Instead, I nodded. Not because I agreed, because I was watching Marin try not to fall apart at her own family table. On the drive back, we barely spoke until we reached the highway. Dallas lights stretched ahead of us, clean and bright against the dark. "I'm sorry," she said. "You keep saying that." "Because they keep giving me reasons to." I kept both hands on the wheel for a moment before reaching over and taking hers. "I married you," I said, "not their expectations." She looked out the window, but I saw her wipe her cheek with the back of her hand. After the wedding, I thought distance might soften them. It didn't. Thanksgiving came first. Marin received the invitation by text. I didn't. She asked her mother if that was a mistake. Lenora replied, "Of course Callan may come if he isn't busy." If he isn't busy. Like I was a neighbor they didn't mind feeding. At Christmas, Sable posted family photos from the staircase. Everyone wore navy and cream. Marin stood beside her mother. I was there that evening, holding Coach near the entryway, when the photographer said, "Immediate family first." I stepped back. No one told me to step in after. At Mercer's promotion dinner, my place card read, Colin, not Callan. Marin started to correct it, but I touched her wrist under the table. "Don't," I said quietly. "They know my name." By Lenora's birthday brunch, I understood the pattern. I was included just enough to keep Marin from accusing them of cruelty, but excluded enough to remind me I had no real seat. Then came the portrait. We had stopped by the Vale house one Sunday afternoon because Marin wanted to drop off a birthday gift. I waited in the foyer while she went upstairs with her mother. That's when I saw it. A new family portrait hanging near the dining room. Orson, Lenora, Mercer, Sable, Marin, all smiling. I stared at the space beside my wife. I had stood there when the photograph was taken. I remembered the photographer adjusting my shoulder. I remembered Marin leaning into me. But in the framed version, I was gone. Not cropped out by accident, removed. Marin came downstairs and saw what I was looking at. For a second, neither of us moved. Then she whispered, "They edited you out." I said nothing. Have you ever felt like someone slowly erased you from their life without ever saying a single cruel word? Sometimes silence leaves deeper scars than anger. I'd love to know if you've ever experienced something like that. Marin wanted to confront them right then. I could see it in her face, that tired mix of anger and grief. I shook my head. They've already made their decision. Then why do you keep letting it go? She asked. I looked back at the portrait. Because I'm not asking you to choose between us. Her voice softened. Then what are you asking? I didn't have a good answer. Finally, I said, time. She didn't understand. Honestly, neither did I. That evening, I drove home alone after dropping Marin at her studio. At a red light near Mockingbird Lane, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked calm. That was the problem. I had become very good at looking calm while people took pieces of me and called it peace. The light turned green. Cars moved around me, and one thought stayed in my head the whole way home. Maybe proving my worth to people determined not to see it was the most expensive thing I'd ever done. Before my father-in-law ever looked down on me, someone else had already taught me that the youngest son was supposed to give up his seat first. That thought followed me longer than I wanted to admit. At first, I blamed the Vales because they were easy to point to. Orson with his polished insults, Lenora with her careful silence, Mercer with that little half-smile he wore whenever I entered a room. Like I was a mistake Marin would eventually outgrow. But after seeing myself erased from that family portrait, something shifted. It wasn't just them. They had simply found a place inside me that was already trained to step back. I grew up in a small house in Plano, where nobody ever said I was unwanted. My parents weren't cruel people. Bram and Arden Voss worked hard. They paid bills on time when they could. They taught us to say thank you, shake hands, and never act bigger than we were. But in our house, there was a rule no one put into words. Keaton got first consideration. I got whatever was left. If there was money for one set of new tires, Keaton needed them more because his commute was longer. If someone had to miss a school trip, I could handle it because I was easygoing. If dinner conversation turned toward accomplishments, his were discussed like family news. Mine were usually met with, "That's great, son," before the subject moved on. I didn't question it back then. Kids don't usually challenge the weather in the house they grow up in. They just learn where to stand so they don't get wet. When Keaton bought his first home, my parents helped with a down payment. I was genuinely happy for him. I remember carrying boxes into his garage and laughing while he complained about property taxes like he had just joined adulthood and deserved applause for it. A few years later, when I was trying to find an apartment closer to work, I asked my father if he thought I should buy instead of rent. He rubbed his jaw and said, "You've always been resourceful, Callan. You'll figure it out." That was the blessing I usually received. Not help, not celebration. Confidence that I could survive without either. College was the same. I worked nights stocking inventory at a medical supply warehouse, then went to classes during the day. I built simple software tools between shifts because the warehouse system was outdated and half the orders were tracked on paper. My parents were helping Keaton through graduate school at the time, so I didn't ask for anything. Part of me was proud of that. Another part of me was just tired. I thought sacrifice proved love. I hadn't learned yet that sacrifice, when nobody notices it, slowly becomes your assigned role. During my first software internship in Richardson, I met Alden Cross. He was a retired systems engineer who volunteered as a mentor for young founders. He wore plain shirts, drove a 10-year-old sedan, and had the sharpest mind of anyone I'd ever met. He never asked who my parents were. He never asked where I came from. He asked what problem I was trying to solve. One evening, after reviewing an early version of my logistics platform, he leaned back and said, "Callan, stop trying to impress people who already decided what box you belong in. Build something that speaks after you leave the room." At the time, I thought he was talking about software. Years later, I understood he was talking about me. That lesson should have protected me sooner. It didn't. Old habits don't leave just because someone gives you better advice. So when Orson dismissed my company, I smiled. When Lenora forgot to include my name, I made it easy for Marin. When Mercer joked that I was still chasing that little app dream, I let the comment pass because I didn't want dinner ruined. I told myself I was being mature. Really, I was practicing the same old performance. Don't make trouble. Don't ask for too much. Don't become the reason people are disappointed. One evening after the portrait incident, Marin found me sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open and nothing on the screen. She had just come home from her studio, still wearing the black flats she used when she had been standing all day with clients. She set her bag down and looked at me for a long moment. "This isn't just about my parents, is it?" I closed the laptop. "No," I said. "I don't think it is." She sat across from me, quiet enough to let the truth come out on its own. So I told her about Keaton, about my parents, about all the times I had been praised for needing less. I expected her to defend them the way people often do when families are complicated. She didn't. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "Callan," she said softly, "I don't think your kindness is the problem." I looked at her. "I think you've confused being needed with being valued." That hit harder than any insult Orson had ever dressed up as advice. Has someone ever made you believe your kindness was weakness? Looking back now, do you think you were being generous or simply giving away too much of yourself? I didn't have an answer that night, but a different question started forming. For most of my life, I had asked, what else can I do to earn their respect? Sitting there with Marin, in the quiet of our kitchen, I wondered something far more dangerous. What if respect was never mine to earn? A few months later, my company began growing faster than even Alden had predicted. And the strange thing was, the more successful I became, the harder I worked to hide it. While everyone else kept measuring my life by the truck I drove, they never once asked what I was quietly building after everyone had gone home. The strange thing about building something in silence is that people mistake your quiet for failure. Crescent Meridian started in a small office in Richardson with stained carpet, leased servers, and 6 people who believed in the problem more than the paycheck. We built logistics software for hospitals, the kind of system nobody talks about unless it fails. Medical supplies, vendor delays, inventory gaps, emergency restocks. It wasn't flashy work. It mattered. Most mornings I got to the office before sunrise. By the time I drove home, the cleaning crew was usually finishing the hallways. Marin would leave dinner covered on the stove, with a note beside it that said something simple like, "Eat before answering emails." She never made me feel small for working late. That alone made her different from almost everyone else. As contracts grew, our life didn't change much. I kept my pickup. We stayed in our modest house. We paid down debt, built savings, and avoided pretending to be wealthier than we were. A friend once joked, "Callan, you get more successful every quarter and somehow look less impressive every year." I laughed because he meant it kindly, but he wasn't wrong. Freedom mattered more to me than appearances. Marin understood that. Her family never did. At a Sunday dinner at the Vale House, Orson asked about my work while passing the salad, like he was making polite conversation with a stranger. "So, Callan, how's that little software thing coming along?" Marin set her fork down. "It's a company, Dad." Orson gave her a patient smile. "Of course, I only mean these tech ventures can be unpredictable." Mercer leaned back in his chair. "Maybe after his app takes off, he can teach us all how to retire early." A couple of people chuckled. I didn't. Not because it hurt the way it used to, because 3 days earlier, Crescent Meridian had signed a regional hospital network worth more than anything Mercer had personally brought into Vale construction that year. I simply took a sip of water and said, "It keeps me busy." That bothered Mercer more than any argument would have. Some people expect you to defend yourself. When you don't, they feel cheated out of the fight. By then, our company had engineers in Dallas, Austin, and Tulsa. We had clients across Texas and Oklahoma, and 2 healthcare groups in New Mexico had asked for pilots. We turned down investors who wanted fast returns at the cost of stability. Alden Cross told me once, "Fast money usually comes with fast hands on your steering wheel." I listened. One afternoon, Crescent Meridian received an innovation award from a healthcare technology group. My team celebrated with barbecue in the break room. Someone handed me a plaque. Everyone clapped. I looked at those faces and felt something I never felt in the Vale dining room. Seen. Not worshipped. Not praised for show. Just seen. I never told Orson about the award. At first, that surprised even me. Then I realized I had stopped wanting to bring him evidence. Some people don't ignore your accomplishments because they haven't heard about them. They ignore them because accepting them would force them to rewrite the story they prefer. At home that night, Marin found the plaque still wrapped in brown paper on the kitchen counter. "You didn't mention this to my family," she said. "No." "Why not?" I leaned against the sink, tired but calm. "Because I'm done carrying proof to people who enjoy pretending they can't read." She studied me for a moment. That was the first time I saw concern in her eyes that wasn't about her parents. It was about me changing. At the next family gathering, Lenora introduced Mercer to a guest as the future of Vale construction. Then she turned toward me and paused just long enough to make it awkward. "And this is Marin's husband, Callan. Not founder, not business owner, not even software executive. Marin's husband." That used to sting. This time it clarified something. Have you ever realized some people had already decided who you were long before they ever got to know you? At what point do you stop trying to prove them wrong and simply start living your own life? On the drive home, Marin apologized again. I reached across the console and covered her hand. "You don't have to apologize for choices you didn't make." She looked at me carefully. I added, "I spent too much time hoping they'd see me. I'm not chasing that anymore." The rest of the ride was quiet, but not uncomfortable. It felt like a door closing softly. A few weeks later, after a routine client call, my assistant knocked and said, Naomi Ashbrook wanted 15 minutes. Naomi was a private equity partner who had followed Crescent Meridian for years. I almost pushed the meeting to the next week, but something in her message made me stay. When the video call opened, she skipped the usual small talk. "Callan," she said, "if you were ever open to selling, Would you consider a serious conversation? I looked through the glass wall of my office at the team working outside. People I trusted. People who had given years to something most of the world never noticed. What kind of serious? I asked. Naomi smiled. The kind that changes your calendar. 3 months later, I walked into a conference room carrying a leather portfolio and expecting a difficult negotiation. When I walked out, everything I thought I knew about my future had changed. The contract in front of me was worth $186 million. Strangely enough, the first thing I thought about wasn't the money. It was 3 empty chairs. The contract sat in front of me like it belonged to somebody else. $186 million. Lawyers moved through the final pages with calm voices. Advisors checked figures. Naomi Ashbrook, who had pushed the deal across the finish line, didn't smile until the last signature was on the last page. When the room finally applauded, I just stared at my name. Callan Voss. Black ink on white paper. Years of early mornings, missed weekends, payroll worries, client calls, and quiet doubt had been reduced to a purchase price. Everyone expected me to look thrilled. I felt grateful. I also felt strangely hollow. The contract changed my bank account in one afternoon. It couldn't change a single memory. I left the law office without calling anyone. Not my parents, not Keaton, certainly not the Vales. The drive home took longer than usual because traffic on Central Expressway was backed up. But I didn't mind. I needed the silence. My phone kept lighting up on the passenger seat. Attorneys, advisors, bankers, people who had suddenly discovered I was worth returning calls quickly. By the time I pulled into our driveway, the sun had dropped behind the trees. Marin was in the backyard watering the flower beds. She looked up when I opened the gate and stopped before I said a word. "What happened?" she asked. I handed her the folder. She dried her hands on a towel and opened it carefully. Her eyes moved over the page once, then again. When she reached the final figure, her face changed. "Callan," she whispered. "Is this real?" I nodded. She didn't jump. She didn't talk about houses or cars or vacations. She walked straight into my arms and held me like she knew exactly how tired I was. That was the moment I almost cried. Not because I had money, because the one person who saw me when I had nothing was still the first person I wanted beside me when everything changed. Over the next few days, the practical conversations began. Wealth management, tax planning, charitable structures, employee retention, real estate, aviation, investment strategy. People kept asking what I wanted to buy first. I gave the same answer every time. Security for my employees, protection for our clients, and a fund for founders who didn't grow up with anyone writing checks for them. A few advisors looked surprised. I wasn't. Money can make people loud. I had no interest in becoming louder. Late that week, after Marin had gone to bed, I walked into the garage and sat behind the wheel of my old pickup. The cab still smelled faintly like leather, dust, and the coffee I spilled near the cup holder 2 winters earlier. I didn't turn the engine on. I just sat there with both hands resting on the wheel. For the first time, I let myself ask the question I had been avoiding. If Orson knew tomorrow, would he respect me? The answer came so fast it almost embarrassed me. No, he would respect the money. That was not the same thing. If someone suddenly became wealthy tomorrow, would it erase the years they spent being overlooked? Or would it simply reveal who only valued them for what they had? I'd love to hear what you think. I looked through the windshield at the dark garage door and thought about those 3 chairs at our wedding. They hadn't been empty because of a scheduling conflict. They had been empty because Orson and Lenora decided my presence made their daughter smaller. That kind of judgment doesn't vanish when the poor man becomes rich. It just changes clothes. For the next several days, I debated telling Marin's family. If I stayed quiet, they would keep treating me like a failure. If I told them, every future conversation would be about access, loans, investments, introductions, a seat at a table they had never offered when all I brought was myself. Success was supposed to feel like freedom. Instead, it handed me a new problem. It showed me who might come running if they ever saw the gate open. That Friday afternoon, I met Willa Hart at a mentorship session for young entrepreneurs. She was 27, sharp as anything, and nervous in the way talented people sometimes are when they have spent too long being dismissed. She showed me her business plan, then folded her hands and said, "Sometimes I think people stop listening as soon as they hear where I came from." I looked at her, and for a second I wasn't in that conference room. I was back at Orson's table, back beside the family portrait, back in every room where I had been tolerated but never welcomed. Years earlier, I would have given Willa the kind of safe encouragement people hand out when they don't want to get involved. Instead, I told her the truth. Then don't spend your life begging those people to listen. Build something they can't ignore, but don't lose yourself doing it. She nodded slowly. When I returned to my office, I stood by the window and watched the traffic moving below. For once, the question in my mind wasn't whether I had finally earned respect. It was whether staying silent would teach the wrong lesson. 3 days later, Marin posted a photograph from a short business trip we took after meeting with foundation advisors. It was just us stepping down from my newly purchased $15 million jet, hand in hand, tired but grateful. Her caption was one word: grateful. Within 24 hours, my phone rang with a name I had not seen in years: Orson Vale. The photo wasn't meant to impress anyone. Marin posted it late in the afternoon after we landed at Love Field and came home tired from meetings with advisors. We were both walking down the steps of the jet, hand in hand. No champagne, no designer pose, no long caption about success. Just one word: grateful. I didn't think much of it. Marin had always shared small pieces of our life, usually flowers from the backyard, sketches from her studio, or pictures of diner breakfasts on road trips. This photo happened to include the plane I had purchased after the acquisition. A $15 million jet, my advisors argued, made sense for foundation travel and investor meetings. To me, it was transportation. To someone else, it was proof. The next afternoon, I was in my office reviewing early scholarship proposals when my phone vibrated beside a stack of folders. Orson Vale. I stared at the screen for a moment. He had not called after our wedding, not after the family portrait, not after holidays where Marin sat across from me trying not to care. But one photo of a private jet did what years of marriage had not. I answered, "Callan, no hello, no congratulations, no, how is my daughter?" Just my name, spoken like a door he expected to open. "Orson." I saw the airplane. There it was, not even hidden. "I figured you did." A pause. "We need to talk. Family meeting tomorrow, 2 o'clock. I leaned back in my chair and looked out over downtown Dallas. "Is this about Marin?" I asked. "Or my money?" The silence lasted long enough to answer for him. Then he said, "It's about family." People use that word differently when they need something. I said, "I'll be there." After I hung up, I sat still for another minute. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. Something colder and clearer had taken anger's place. At home that evening, Marin was standing at the kitchen island sorting mail when I told her. Her shoulders dropped before I finished. "He called because of the photo," she said. "Yes. I'm sorry." I set my keys down and walked around the island. "No, you don't carry this one." She looked at me carefully. "Are you going?" "I am." "Why?" I thought about it before answering. Because tomorrow isn't really about money. It's about who finally controls the conversation. Later that night, after dinner, I went into my study to prepare. I had barely opened my laptop when an email came from Dorian Pike, my attorney. The subject line was simple: archived Vale correspondence. Dorian had been reviewing old files connected to Marin's family business because one of the banks holding Vale Construction's debt had quietly put part of that debt on the market. We had been looking at it from a business angle. Then I opened one attachment and stopped breathing for a second. Subject: wedding. From Orson Vale to Marin Vale. The message was short. If you marry him, don't expect us to be there. No conflict, no emergency, no misunderstanding. They had not missed our wedding. They had chosen absence as punishment. I read the sentence once, then again. Then I pushed back from the desk and stood there in the quiet room, listening to the air conditioner hum. If you discovered proof that someone had chosen to hurt you all along, would it bring you peace or simply take away the last excuse you were holding on to? What do you think? For years, I had left room for an explanation. Now there was no room left. I printed the email and placed it in a folder. Not for revenge. Revenge is loud. It rushes. It wants an audience. I wanted clarity. The next morning, I met Dorian at his office before 9. He had already prepared the debt purchase documents, bank notices, and restructuring options. Vale Construction had violated loan covenants twice. Their lender wanted out. The purchase had been legal, clean, and completed through an investment entity days earlier. Dorian tapped the folder with one finger. They'll expect a check. They won't get one. Good, keep it simple. Let them talk first. That was exactly what I planned to do. By noon, everything I needed was inside one leather briefcase. No cash, no checkbook, no emotional speech written on paper, just documents, ownership records, debt agreements, the email. Before leaving, I called Naomi Ashbrook and asked her to delay the foundation announcement until after the meeting. Trouble? She asked. Family, I said. She understood more from that one word than most people would from a full explanation. At 1:30, I walked into the garage. The old pickup sat beside the newer cars I barely drove. I chose the truck. Not by accident. If the Vales only recognized value when it arrived polished and expensive, they were about to misunderstand me one last time. The drive to Highland Park felt shorter than it used to. The same streets, the same lawns, the same quiet houses that looked too proper to hold anything messy inside. When I turned into the Vale driveway, I saw the front door open before I parked. Orson was waiting. So were Lenora and Mercer. As I stepped out of the pickup with the briefcase in my hand, I realized something I never could have imagined on my wedding day. The people waiting inside no longer had the power to decide who I was. When the front door opened fully, no one welcomed me home. They welcomed what they believed I could do for them. The formal dining room looked exactly the way I remembered it. Same long table, same silver-framed family photographs on the sideboard, same chandelier hanging over the room like a judge waiting for someone to confess. Only the faces had changed. Orson greeted me with a handshake so firm it felt rehearsed. Lenora asked whether traffic had been difficult. Mercer offered coffee as though we had seen each other the week before. No one said, "We're sorry." No one mentioned the wedding. No one mentioned the years when my name was missing from invitations, portraits, and holiday tables. Instead, there was a folder already waiting in front of my chair. Financial recovery plan. I almost smiled. They had prepared spreadsheets before they had prepared an apology. Marin sat beside me, quiet but steady. I placed the leather briefcase near my feet and waited. Orson opened the meeting like a board presentation. Vale Construction had cash flow problems. 2 commercial projects had stalled. A lender was demanding additional guarantees. A major subcontractor was threatening to walk unless past invoices were paid. He spoke calmly. Like a man describing weather damage to property he still expected someone else to repair. Then he folded his hands. "You've done well for yourself, Callan. Family should help family." I looked at him for a moment. "Would you have called if I were still driving that same truck without the company?" Nobody answered. Mercer shifted in his chair. Lenora glanced at Marin. Orson looked down at the folder, pretending to review a page he already knew by heart. That silence was cleaner than honesty. Orson slid a document across the table. At the bottom, my name had already been typed under guarantor. Callan Voss. They had printed my name on their rescue plan before asking whether I wanted to be part of it. "That's not a request," I said. Orson's jaw tightened. It's a proposal. No, a proposal waits for consent. Lenora stepped in with that polished voice of hers. We're not asking for ourselves. This affects Marin's future too. Mercer leaned forward. If Dad loses the company, the family name takes the hit. You understand reputation, don't you? I looked at him. I understand earning one. His mouth closed. Then Orson used the card I knew was coming. If you love your wife, prove it. The room changed after that. They were no longer asking for money. They were questioning my marriage. Marin's hand found mine beneath the table. For years, I had protected her from this exact conversation. I had absorbed the comments, the missing invitations, the little public dismissals. This time she spoke before I could. My husband has spent years protecting me from the way you treat him, she said. Today, I'm protecting him. Lenora's face tightened. Marin, don't be dramatic. I'm not being dramatic, Mom. I'm being honest. If someone questioned your love simply because you refused to give them money, what would you have done? Do financial obligations ever outweigh respect? Orson exhaled through his nose. This is not the time for emotional speeches. No, I said quietly. It's the time for documents. I lifted the leather briefcase onto the table. Mercer's eyes dropped to it immediately. I could almost see him looking for a checkbook. I opened the latches. There was no check, no wire transfer form, no bailout letter. I removed one folder and placed it in front of Orson. Then another. Debt purchase agreement, independent valuation report, loan covenant review, corporate restructuring plan. Dorian had organized every page in order. Clean, legal, dated, signed. Orson picked up the top sheet, then stopped moving. I said, I didn't come to invest in Vale Construction. Mercer stared at the papers. What is this? The bank offered the debt for purchase after the covenant breach. My investment entity bought it. Lenora whispered, You bought our debt? Yes. Orson stood so abruptly his chair scraped the floor. You planned this? No, I said. I planned to protect people who never had the power to protect themselves. He looked like I had struck him, though I had barely raised my voice. I continued, Every employee keeps their job. Every supplier gets paid. Retirement accounts remain protected. Current projects continue, but executive control changes immediately. Mercer's face lost color. You can't just remove us. I'm not removing a family, I said. I'm removing mismanagement. Orson pointed at me. This is revenge. No, revenge would have let the company collapse and watched you explain it to the people who trusted you. The room went silent. I slid one final page toward him. An independent CEO takes over. You and Mercer step out of operations. The board votes tomorrow morning. Lenora looked at Marin. You're going to let him do this to your father? Marin's voice was steady. No, Dad did this to himself. That was the moment I saw Orson understand. The man he had dismissed as dirt poor had not come begging for a place at his table. I had come with the table's legal title in my briefcase. I gathered the papers I needed and stood. Orson said, You're making a mistake. I looked at him one last time. The mistake was thinking I'd stay useful after you made me invisible. Then I picked up my briefcase. I'll give you until tomorrow morning to decide whether you want dignity or denial. No one followed us to the door. Outside, the afternoon sun hit the windshield of my old pickup. Marin and I walked to it without speaking. Once we were inside, she reached over and touched my hand. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. That night, I believed the hardest part was finally behind me. I was wrong. By sunrise, Orson had launched one final attack. This time, he wasn't aiming at my money. He was aiming at my name. By 6:15 the next morning, my phone was already moving across the nightstand from the vibration. At first, I thought it was Dorian. Then I saw 12 missed calls, 26 messages, and 3 emails marked urgent. Marin sat up beside me, still half asleep. What happened? I opened the first link. A Dallas business blog had published a story before sunrise. Local founder accused of forcing wife's family out of company. The article didn't name Orson as the source. It didn't have to. It painted him as a respected businessman, cornered by a wealthy son-in-law who had used a family crisis to gain control. By 7, the story had spread to LinkedIn. By 8, Mercer had posted his own statement. Money can buy assets. It can't buy character. I read it twice. Then I set the phone down. Marin looked at me, waiting for anger. I gave her strategy instead. I called Dorian. Find out who fed the story, I said. I already know, he replied. Orson made calls last night. Mercer hired a public relations consultant before midnight. That almost made me laugh. They had moved faster to protect their image than they ever had to repair their family. By noon, the story had grown teeth. A local podcast repeated Mercer's claim that I had married into opportunity. A retired investor asked publicly whether I had manipulated Marin to gain access to Vail Construction. That one got to her. She turned off the television and stood there with the remote in her hand. They've been rewriting our story for years, she said. Not anymore. I drove to Dorian's office after lunch. Traffic was heavy, so I used the time to breathe before walking into another fight I hadn't asked for. When I arrived, Dorian had a banker's box on the conference table and a folder already open. This is why we document, he said. Inside were emails, certified letters, meeting notes, and rejected advisory offers I had made to Vail Construction years earlier. I had never offered money. I had offered help with supply chain software, contract tracking, and project delays. Orson declined every time. One note in Mercer's handwriting read, Callan's small-time software isn't relevant to our scale. Another folder held the wedding email. If you marry him, don't expect us to be there. Dorian tapped the page. You don't need to attack them. You need to let the dates speak. So that's what I did. At 3 o'clock, I held the press event already scheduled for the Empty Chair Initiative. Reporters arrived expecting a family dispute. I gave them 20 minutes on scholarships, first-generation founders, employee stability, and why entrepreneurship should not belong only to people born near money. Then a reporter asked, Mr. Voss, did you use your wealth to take control of your wife's family business? I opened the same briefcase Mercer had mistaken for a checkbook. No, I said. I used documented debt rights to protect employees after leadership defaulted on obligations. I placed 3 documents on the podium: the bank notice, the rejected advisory letters, the wedding email. No insults, no raised voice, just dates. Then I said, I won't argue with anyone's version of events. I'll allow the timeline to speak for itself. The room went still. If you had undeniable proof that someone lied about you for years, would you expose everything publicly or simply walk away? There's no easy answer. I'd like to know where you stand. An hour later, Vail Construction's emergency board meeting began. By then, the lenders had seen enough. The independent directors had reviewed Dorian's file. Mercer resigned before anyone could vote him out. Orson sat at the end of the table while the company he built moved beyond his control. When the others left, he stayed seated. I entered only to sign the final restructuring plan. Employees kept their jobs. Retirees kept their benefits. Projects continued. Gideon Rusk would step in as independent CEO. Orson looked smaller than he had the day before. Was this revenge? He asked. No, I said. Revenge would have destroyed the company. Accountability saved it. He looked down at his hands. For once, he had no polished answer. I signed the plan and closed the folder. Outside, a few cameras were still waiting. They caught me walking to my old pickup with the same briefcase in my hand. Later, I heard that photo traveled farther than the jet picture ever had. Maybe people understood the point. Maybe they simply liked the contrast. Either way, I didn't stop to explain it. That night, after reporters left and my phone finally quieted, I drove somewhere I hadn't visited in years, not because I needed answers, because I finally knew what to do with the life I had spent trying to earn. Some victories don't end with applause. They begin with the quiet realization that you're finally free to become the person you were always meant to be. Some victories don't arrive with music. Mine came in quieter pieces. A year after the board vote, the headlines had disappeared. The business blogs had moved on. The people who had called me ruthless now used softer words like disciplined, strategic, and principled. Vale Construction was still operating, but under Gideon Rusk and a real oversight board. Employees kept their jobs. Retirees kept their benefits. Projects that had nearly collapsed were finally moving again. Orson no longer sat at the head of that table. Mercer had taken a consulting role somewhere in Fort Worth, which sounded more graceful than remove before he caused more damage. As for me, I spent most of my time at the Empty Chair Initiative. The building wasn't fancy. It had exposed brick, wide windows, old concrete floors, and folding chairs that never matched. I liked it that way. It felt honest. One Thursday afternoon, I sat with Willa Hart and three young founders who reminded me too much of myself. Bright, careful, always apologizing before asking a question. One of them, a young man named Elias, said, "My family still calls this business a hobby." I smiled, not because it was funny, because I knew how heavy that word could feel when it came from people you wanted to make proud. I told him, "You don't need permission to become the person you're capable of being." He looked down at his notebook like he might write it down. I hoped he did. A few weeks later, a letter arrived at our house. No email, no attorney, no messenger, just a handwritten envelope from Orson Vale. I waited until after dinner to open it. Marin sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Neither of us spoke while I read. Orson's apology was short. He admitted he had confused success with status. He admitted he had judged me before knowing me. He admitted, in plain words, that he and Lenora had missed our wedding by choice. The last line stayed with me. "I don't expect forgiveness. I only wanted you to know that I finally understand what I destroyed." I folded the letter slowly. Marin asked, "Are you okay?" "Yes," I said. "I think I am." That didn't mean everything was fixed. Some apologies are real and still arrive too late to rebuild what they broke. A few days later, I agreed to meet Orson at a quiet park near Turtle Creek. No lawyers, no board members, no family audience. Just two men sitting on a bench while joggers moved past us and traffic hummed beyond the trees. He looked older, not defeated exactly, more human. "I owe you more than one apology," he said. "You do?" He nodded. "I know." For once, he didn't try to dress the truth in better clothes. He said he was ashamed of the wedding email. He said he had punished Marin for choosing me because he thought control was the same thing as protection. He said he had spent his life believing a family name could cover a man's mistakes. Then he looked at me and asked, "Can things ever go back?" I shook my head gently. "No, some doors aren't meant to reopen. But that doesn't mean we have to keep standing outside them forever." He accepted that. We shook hands. Nothing more, nothing less. That evening, Marin and I hosted a small celebration for the newest scholarship recipients. The room filled with students, parents, grandparents, mentors, and a few people who had no blood connection at all, but showed up like family anyway. Near the back wall, I noticed 3 empty chairs. A volunteer hurried over, embarrassed. "I'm sorry, Mr. Voss, we forgot to move those." I looked at the chairs, then at Marin. She understood before I said anything. "Leave them," I told the volunteer. For a moment, I was back at our wedding. Same absence, same quiet ache. But then 3 scholarship recipients walked in late with their families and took those seats. Just like that, the symbol changed. Those chairs no longer belonged to people who chose not to come. They belonged to people who did. Later that night, I drove home in my old pickup. It still rattled over rough pavement. The cup holder still stuck if I pulled it too hard. I could have replaced it 100 times over. I didn't want to. Marin climbed in beside me and laughed softly. You know, most people with your bank account don't drive trucks with duct tape in the glove compartment. This one reminds me never to confuse appearance with value. She reached for my hand. Have you ever reached a point where you stopped trying to earn someone's approval and simply chose peace instead? If you've experienced something similar, I'd truly like to read your story in the comments. When we pulled into our driveway, I sat there for a moment before turning off the engine. The richest moment of my life wasn't signing a contract worth $186 million. It wasn't stepping off a private jet. It wasn't watching Orson lose control of the company he had used as a crown. It was understanding that my value had never depended on anyone else's approval. I had spent half my life trying to be invited into rooms where people had already decided I didn't belong. Now I build rooms with open seats. And that, more than any check, title, or headline, is what finally made me free.